The morning of July 14th, 1944. A farm field 6 kilometers northwest of Saint-Lô, France. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood with his staff, arms crossed, watching a light tank roll backward from the earthen wall that had defined warfare in Normandy for 6 brutal weeks. The tank's engine revved. 4 steel tusks protruded from its bow like the horns of some mechanical beast. At 10 miles per hour, it charged the hedgerow. The tusks bored into the ancient wall, pinning the tank's belly against the ground as it should have been, preventing the fatal climb that exposed vulnerable armor to waiting German guns. The tank plowed through under a cascade of dirt and tangled roots, emerging on the far side of what had been, until 30 seconds ago, an impenetrable barrier. A Sherman followed, equipped identically, and duplicated the performance with brutal efficiency. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Bradley turned to Colonel John Medaris of the Army Ordnance Department. Within hours, Medaris would be on a plane to England with orders to conscript every depot, every welding crew, every scrap of available steel. What Bradley had witnessed was the product of an idea so simple it had baffled an entire army for 5 weeks, fashioned by a 29-year-old sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, who had violated every protocol and ignored every proper channel to solve a problem that was bleeding his army white. The device Curtis Cullen had created from salvaged German beach obstacles would be welded onto 3 out of every 5 tanks in the First Army before Operation Cobra launched 11 days later. But the story of how a sergeant's unauthorized welding project transformed American armored warfare begins not with innovation, but with a landscape that had turned tactical doctrine into a death sentence. June 7, 1944. 24 hours after D-Day. The Bocage country of Normandy. American forces pushing inland from the beachheads discovered terrain unlike anything their training had prepared them for. The hedgerows that crisscrossed northwestern France were not the manageable boundaries soldiers had seen in English countryside. These were fortifications built incrementally over 1,000 years, each generation of Norman farmers piling stones cleared from their fields along property lines, creating earthen berms that erosion and time had compacted into walls, averaging 4 feet high and up to 4 feet thick at the base. Growing atop these mounds were hedges that extended the total height to 12 or 15 feet in many locations. Not decorative shrubs, but centuries of accumulated vegetation. Thick brush, small trees, thorns, brambles, and vines intertwined into barriers with root systems so dense they could not be excavated even with heavy machinery. The hedgerows surrounded irregular fields, typically measuring 200 yards by 400 yards, creating a landscape that resembled a vast maze of natural fortifications stretching for 50 miles across the Cotentin Peninsula. American infantry moving through this terrain found visibility limited to a single field at a time. Machine gun ranges that should have extended hundreds of meters were reduced to point-blank distance. Artillery observers could not see targets. Communications between units broke down as hedgerows blocked line of sight. Every field entrance was a choke point that German defenders could cover with interlocking fire from positions dug directly into the earthen walls, providing protection from overhead artillery that would have devastated troops in open terrain. The German 7th Army, undermanned and outgunned, recognized immediately what American planners had failed to anticipate. The Bocage transformed numerical and material inferiority into tactical advantage. A handful of soldiers with machine guns positioned in hedgerow embankments could pin down entire American companies for hours or days. Panzerfaust teams, hidden in the vegetation, could ambush armor moving through the narrow lanes between fields, destroying tanks before crews could identify the threat's location. Tank crews faced a tactical nightmare that contradicted everything their doctrine promised. American armor was supposed to provide mobile firepower supporting infantry advances. In the Bocage, tanks became trapped on narrow sunken roads centuries old, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to ambush. The alternative was attempting to cross the hedgerows themselves, and that option had proven catastrophic from the first attempts. A Sherman tank weighing 30 tons could physically force its way over a hedgerow by climbing the earthen mound. The tank's front would rise, tilting the entire vehicle backward at an angle that exposed the belly armor, typically less than 1 inch thick, to German anti-tank weapons. The tank's 75mm gun would point uselessly at the sky while the crew, unable to see forward or return fire, waited helplessly for the few seconds it took to crest the hedgerow. German gunners learned to wait for this moment. A single Panzerfaust round striking the exposed underside would penetrate the thin armor and detonate ammunition or fuel, transforming the tank into a burning wreck in seconds. By mid-June, charred Sherman hulks littered the Bocage, testimony to a tactical problem that was killing American tank crews at rates that threatened to paralyze the entire Normandy campaign. The infantry could not advance without armor support. The armor could not support infantry without exposing itself to destruction. The stalemate was measured in casualties that shocked commanders who had anticipated rapid exploitation inland from the beachheads. The 30th Infantry Division reported casualties approaching 1,000 men per kilometre of advance between La Haye-du-Puits and Lessay. The 79th Infantry Division lost 1 man every 3 metres during fighting for the village of Montgardon. These were Great War attrition rates in a campaign designed around mobility and breakthrough. The weather compounded every problem. Normandy in June and July brought rain that turned unpaved roads to mud, low clouds that grounded close air support, and persistent gloom that sapped morale among troops who had expected liberation to be swift and decisive. Combat engineers attempted solutions that proved inadequate under field conditions. They used Sherman tanks to ram hedgerows with hollow steel rods, creating holes for explosives. The engineers would then race forward, fully exposed to German fire, to place demolition charges in the holes before retreating to detonate them. The method worked in theory. In practice, American forces did not possess enough explosives to breach the thousands of hedgerows they would encounter during any sustained advance. The explosions, massive and distinctive, immediately attracted German artillery fire and alerted defenders to prepare for assault at the breach point. Some tank battalions employed dozer tanks, standard Shermans fitted with bulldozer blades. Every D-Day battalion had approximately 4 such vehicles out of 70 tanks total. The dozer blades could push through hedgerows given time and effort, but the tanks moved slowly, were highly visible, and became priority targets for German anti-tank teams who learned to recognize them quickly. Destroying a single dozer tank could halt an entire company's advance until engineers cleared the obstruction or found an alternate route. Various units experimented with modifications developed independently. The 79th Infantry Division created a hedge cutter operational by July 5th. Elements of the 19th Corps demonstrated prongs designed initially for creating holes for explosives, but capable of lifting portions of hedgerows. 5th Corps developed devices called brush cutters and green dozers. None achieved sufficient effectiveness or could be manufactured in quantities that mattered strategically. By early July, American forces had been fighting in the Bocage for 4 weeks. Progress was measured in fields captured at appalling cost. The crossroads town of Saint-Lô, a key objective whose capture would open routes into the French interior, remained in German hands despite repeated assaults. General Bradley faced the reality that his First Army was trapped in terrain that negated every American advantage in firepower, logistics, and air superiority. The Germans could not win the Normandy campaign. They lacked reserves, supplies, and the ability to replace losses. But they could make the Allied victory so costly in time and casualties that strategic objectives would become unreachable. Bradley understood that breaking the Bocage stalemate required a dramatic solution, something beyond incremental improvements to existing tactics. What he did not know was that one of his tankers had already found that solution through a combination of battlefield observation, borrowed inspiration, and improvised engineering. Curtis Grubb Coolin III was unremarkable in most respects that military bureaucracies value. Born February 10, 1915 in Cranford, New Jersey, he graduated from Cranford High School in 1937 with grades that suggested competence rather than brilliance. He worked as a sales promotion assistant for Schenley Distillers in New York City, a job that involved window trimming and cost calculations, clerical work that paid steadily during the Depression when steady work was its own achievement. In 1938, Cullen joined the New Jersey National Guard, assigned to the Essex Troop, a cavalry unit that still trained on horseback and held exhibitions of riding skills. The Essex Troop was eventually mechanized and redesignated the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, assigned to the 2nd Armored Division. Cullen landed in France shortly after D-Day as a sergeant and tanker, one of thousands of soldiers whose names appeared on no planning documents and whose opinions shaped no operational decisions. His value to the army was measured in his ability to operate a tank, follow orders, and stay alive long enough to gain experience. What happened next depends on which account you trust, and the accounts conflict in details that suggest institutional memory's tendency to simplify history into stories with clear protagonists. Military historian Max Hastings documented that Cullen's innovation began not with Cullen's own idea, but with inspiration from a soldier others described as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts. During a discussion about overcoming the Bocage, this soldier, whose first name was never recorded in official histories, made a suggestion that drew laughter from those who heard it. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The laughter was predictable. Soldiers under sustained stress often respond to proposals with mockery, particularly proposals that sound too simple to address complex problems. But Cullen did not laugh. He recognized potential in an idea others dismissed. This capacity to see value in unconventional thinking, where trained officers saw only absurdity, would prove more valuable than any engineering degree or tactical manual. Cullen began fabricating a prototype around July 7th or 8th, working without orders, without authorization from his chain of command, using materials and time that officially belonged to the United States Army for purposes the United States Army had not approved. The raw material came from German beach obstacles, specifically the Czech hedgehogs, welded steel beam assemblies the Germans had scattered across Normandy's beaches to damage landing craft. These obstacles, 3 angled steel beams welded together at their centers, had failed their intended purpose. Allied forces captured thousands of them intact during the initial landings. Cullen dismantled the hedgehogs, cutting the steel beams into sections approximately 2 feet long. He welded 4 of these sections onto a horizontal crossbar, creating tusk-like prongs that protruded forward from the tank's bow. The design was crude, nothing an engineer would draw in a technical manual, but crude did not matter if it functioned. On July 14th, 1944, Cullen's prototype underwent demonstration for officers, including Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of all American ground forces in the Normandy invasion. Cullen's commanding officers had brought the device to Bradley's attention after witnessing initial tests, recognizing that a sergeant's improvised modification might solve a problem that was paralyzing First Army operations. Bradley watched as the prototype tank charged the hedgerow. The tusks bit into the earthen wall at ground level, preventing the tank from climbing and exposing its underside. The prongs acted as anchors, holding the tank's belly against the ground while forward momentum drove the tusks through centuries of compacted earth and intertwined roots. The hedgerow disintegrated under mechanical force it had never been designed to resist. Dirt, stones, vegetation exploded outward. The tank burst through under a canopy of debris, emerging on the far side operationally intact, crew unharmed, guns still horizontal and capable of engaging targets. A Sherman equipped identically duplicated the performance seconds later. Bradley's documented response, recorded by multiple witnesses including his own memoir published years later, captured both his recognition of the device's importance and his frustration that 5 weeks of casualties had preceded this solution. So absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks, he would write. The task-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Cullen, a 29-year-old sergeant. Bradley's orders to Colonel Medaris were immediate and explicit. The device was to be manufactured in quantity using every available resource. Medaris was dispatched to England that same evening to conscript depot facilities and arrange for tanks to be modified before shipping to France. By 6 that evening, units in France determined they would need additional arc welding equipment beyond what was available in theatre. A plane departed for England by 8 p.m., Trucks waited at the airstrip when it returned before breakfast the next morning, carrying welding equipment and crews to begin round-the-clock production. The steel came from Rommel's underwater obstacles, the same beach defences that were supposed to prevent Allied landings, but instead provided raw material for the modification that would break German defensive lines. Army ordnance units across Normandy received orders to fabricate and weld cutters onto Sherman tanks continuously until Operation Cobra launched. The work continued day and night under camouflage netting to prevent German reconnaissance from observing the activity and deducing American intentions. Sergeant Joseph Apple of the 111th Ordnance Company was one of dozens of welders who spent weeks in July cutting steel and welding assemblies. His granddaughter would recall decades later that her grandfather remained proud of this contribution, understanding that the modified tanks he helped create were saving American lives with every hedgerow they penetrated. The fabrication process was neither complex nor particularly time-consuming once materials and welding equipment were available. Each assembly required approximately 30 seconds of welding to attach 4 prongs to a crossbar, then additional time to mount the crossbar to the tank's bow. Crews fashioned and sharpened pieces of scrap steel into blades designed to bite into hedgerows at ground level. Around 500 of these assemblies, officially designated the Cullen Rhino device or Cullen hedgerow cutter, were manufactured in Normandy during the 2 weeks, between Bradley's July 14th observation and Operation Cobra's July 25th launch. These devices were used to modify nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armoured Division's Sherman and Stuart tanks and M10 tank destroyers in preparation for the breakout. Additional production occurred in the United Kingdom. The British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers referred to the devices as prongs and produced 24 initial units from ex-German beach defences before shifting production to British factories. 600 Mark I prongs were delivered by August for Sherman 5 tanks. A further 1,000 Mark II prongs were produced for Shermans and M10 tank destroyers. 500 Mark III prongs were manufactured for Cromwell tanks. By Operation Cobra's launch, 60% of First Army's tanks carried the Rhino modification. Official records documented 1,269 M4 medium tanks, 694 M5A1 light tanks, and 288 M10 tank destroyers available for the offensive. 3 out of every 5 of these vehicles could now breach hedgerows without exposing vulnerable underside armour to enemy fire. Bradley made one additional decision that demonstrated understanding of operational security's importance. He forbade use of the Rhino tanks until Operation Cobra launched. German intelligence would inevitably learn about the modification once tanks equipped with cutters engaged in combat. Every day of German ignorance about American ability to breach hedgerows freely was a day. German defensive planning remained based on false assumptions about American tactical constraints. The surprise value of the Rhino tanks would be maximized if their first large-scale employment came during the major offensive designed to break out of Normandy entirely. Operation Cobra was conceived as the decisive stroke that would shatter German defensive lines and propel American armour into France's interior, ending the Bocage stalemate through overwhelming force applied at a carefully selected breakthrough point. The plan called for massive aerial bombardment to pulverize German positions in a narrow corridor northwest of Saint-Lô, followed immediately by concentrated ground assault that would punch through weakened defences before Germans could recover. The execution did not match the plan's elegant simplicity. Weather delayed the operation from July 18th to 20th, then to 24th, then finally to 25th. On July 24th, clouds forced bombers to abort after some units had already dropped ordnance, resulting in friendly fire casualties. 25 American soldiers died, and 131 were wounded when bombs fell short of intended targets. On July 25th, the operation launched in earnest despite weather that remained less than ideal. 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers dropped nearly 3,300 tons of explosives on a 12-square-kilometre area of Bocage between Montreuil and Hébécrevant. The ground shook from concussions that could be felt miles away. 60,000 incendiary bombs created a firestorm visible from England. German positions were obliterated, forests were levelled, Hedgerows were torn apart by explosive force that exceeded anything seen in previous campaigns. But weather and proximity to friendly forces again resulted in tragedy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 111 Americans died, and nearly 500 were wounded when bombers struck their own units. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in action in the European theater, struck by a bomb while observing the attack from the front lines. Despite these catastrophic failures in air support coordination, the ground assault that followed achieved results that justified Bradley's strategic vision. German defensive positions that had held for weeks collapsed within hours once American armor broke through the initial crust of resistance. The Rhino tanks fulfilled every promise Kulin's prototype had demonstrated. Columns of Shermans equipped with cutters smashed through hedgerows in rapid succession, bypassing German strongpoints rather than engaging them frontally, emerging behind enemy lines before defenders could reposition. Infantry followed through the breaches, consolidating gains before Germans could organize counterattacks. The modification solved the tactical problem that had paralyzed American operations since June. Tanks no longer needed to climb hedgerows, no longer exposed their vulnerable undersides, no longer gave German anti-tank teams the perfect shot they had been exploiting for weeks. The psychological impact on German defenders matched the tactical advantage Americans gained. German soldiers who had learned to wait for the moment when American tanks climbed hedgerows discovered those moments no longer came. Tanks simply appeared through walls that were supposed to be impenetrable, firing as they emerged, giving defenders no time to react before being overrun or forced to retreat. Tank commanders who had approached every hedgerow with justified fear now drove through terrain with confidence that transformed tactical decision-making. Crews took calculated risks they would have avoided when every hedgerow represented mortal danger. Armored columns maintained momentum that previously would have been impossible in bocage terrain. The engineering principles underlying the Rhino cutter's effectiveness were straightforward, but had eluded military thinking trapped in assumptions about proper solutions requiring complex engineering. The tusks functioned as plows operating at ground level rather than climbing devices. The forward prongs bit into the hedgerow's base, where centuries of compacted earth and stone provided solid anchorage. As the tank's weight pushed forward, the prongs cut through root systems horizontally while preventing upward movement. The tank's mass and engine power, concentrated through 4 relatively small contact points, generated force sufficient to shear through vegetation and displace soil that would have resisted human excavation even with explosives. The hedgerow did not need to be destroyed completely, merely breached enough for a tank to pass through. The modification succeeded because Kulin understood, whether through intuition or observation, that the problem was not the hedgerow's strength, but the tank's approach angle. Prevent the climb, maintain horizontal force application, and obstacles that had seemed insurmountable became penetrable. This solution was so simple that officers trained in engineering and tactics had overlooked it for 5 weeks while searching for complex answers involving specialized equipment or extensive preparation. A sales promotion assistant from New Jersey with no formal engineering training had recognized what professionals missed, that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem is a crude modification that changes one variable. By July 27th, American forces had overrun Perriers, captured after weeks of fighting at terrible cost. July 28th brought the fall of Coutances, opening routes south and west. German Field Marshal Günther von Klug reported to Berlin that the front had collapsed into wild combat, with only scattered bands of exhausted soldiers offering any resistance to American armor that was being constantly refreshed by reinforcements, while German units received nothing. The breakout Bradley had envisioned was becoming reality. American armored columns, freed from bocage constraints by Rhino modifications, advanced rapidly across terrain, where mobility mattered more than defensive positions. German commanders could not establish successive defensive lines because American tanks were penetrating before positions could be fortified. The tactical initiative had shifted permanently. German forces fought desperate rearguard. Actions as scattered units attempted to retreat to the Seine, abandoning equipment when fuel shortages made withdrawal impossible. Curtis Coulin received the Legion of Merit for his invention, an award typically reserved for sustained exceptional service rather than single innovations. The recognition acknowledged that his device had fundamentally altered the Normandy campaign's trajectory at precisely the moment when stalemate threatened to prolong operations into autumn. President Dwight Eisenhower, in a post-presidential address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in January 1961, described the morale impact Cullen's invention produced. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. The happiness was earned through understanding what the modification meant operationally. Tank crews who had faced each hedgerow, knowing they might die in the crossing, now approached the same obstacles with confidence. Infantry who had watched tanks burn while climbing hedgerows now advanced with armoured support that could manoeuvre freely. Commanders who had calculated casualties per kilometre of advance now measured progress in kilometres per day. The operational tempo shifted from grinding attrition to mobile warfare within 72 hours of Cobra's launch. 4 months after his device helped break the Bocage stalemate, Curtis Coulin lost his left leg to a landmine in the Hurtgen forest. The series of brutal battles fought between American and German forces along the German-Belgian border. The injury ended his combat service but did not diminish the historical significance of his contribution. After recovering, he returned to civilian life, resuming his career as a salesman for Schenley Industries, the same company he had worked for before the war. He married Bernice Enright in 1945. They lived in New York City, where Coulin worked until his death in Greenwich Village, in 1963 at age 48. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, but could not convey the impact a sergeant's improvised welding had produced on history's largest amphibious invasion. The British referred to the devices as prongs when they implemented their own production. During Operation Bluecoat, a British offensive in Normandy, Churchill tanks equipped with prongs traversed terrain considered impassable to tracked vehicles, surprising German defenders who had positioned forces based on assumptions about where armour could operate. The tactical value extended beyond American units that received rhino cutters first. Some military historians, including Stephen Zaloga, have questioned whether rhino devices were as widely used or as effective as legend suggests. The historical record indicates around 500 American-manufactured assemblies were produced in Normandy, with additional hundreds produced in Britain. Given that First Army possessed over 2,000 tanks by Cobra's launch, the 60% modification rate claimed in some sources appears inflated if only 500 devices were manufactured. However, other historians, including Max Hastings and Chester Wilmot, credit the invention with restoring battlefield maneuverability to Allied forces. The truth likely falls between competing claims. Rhino cutters were not universal across all American armour in Normandy, but they were distributed widely enough in units conducting breakthrough operations to matter strategically. Alternative hedgerow crossing methods, particularly bulldozer blades, remained important throughout the campaign. Each tank battalion was provided with 5 or 6 dozer tanks for the Cobra breakout, and commanders often found dozer blades more effective than rhino prongs for sustained operations. The distinction matters less than the underlying reality. American forces entered July unable to maneuver armour effectively in Bocage terrain. By early August, they were conducting mobile operations that German forces could not contain. Multiple innovations contributed to this transformation, but Cullen's device was among the first to be implemented at scale and provided immediate tactical advantage. The psychological dimension of the hedgerow crisis deserves emphasis because material solutions alone do not explain American success or German collapse. By early July, American tank crews were approaching hedgerows with mindset-shaped expectation of casualties. The fear was rational, based on weeks of watching tanks burn while crossing obstacles under fire. This fear affected tactical decision-making, made crews hesitant, reduced aggressiveness that mobile warfare requires. German defenders had learned to exploit American reluctance. They positioned themselves to engage tanks at the vulnerable moment of crossing, knowing that tank commanders would avoid hedgerow breaches whenever possible. German defensive doctrine in Bocage terrain depended on American tanks remaining roadbound or exposing themselves when attempting cross-country movement. Cullen's device eliminated the psychological burden as effectively as it solved the mechanical problem. Tank commanders who knew their vehicles could breach hedgerows without exposing undersides approached tactical situations differently. They took risks that previously would have been suicidal. They maintained offensive tempo through terrain that had slowed advances to meters per hour. The transformation was visible to everyone who observed American operations before and after Rhino cutters entered service. The same crews operating the same tanks were fighting more effectively because one sergeant had solved a problem that had seemed insurmountable. German recognition of American hedgerow breaching capability came too late to influence their defensive planning meaningfully. By the time German intelligence officers documented the steel tusks welded to Sherman bows, American armor was already exploiting mobility that German defenses had been designed to prevent. German commanders understood that their doctrine of using bocage as natural fortifications had become obsolete overnight. But they lacked resources to adapt. There were no reserves to reposition, no time to construct alternative defensive lines, no fuel to maneuver what armor remained operational. The Battle of the Hedgerows, as historians would later designate the July fighting around Saint-Lô, cost American forces approximately 7,200 killed and 30,000 wounded during June and July 1944. These casualties were unexpectedly high, approaching attrition rates from First World War trench warfare that modern military doctrine was supposed to have made obsolete. The human cost of learning to fight in terrain American planners had failed to account for properly was measured in thousands of soldiers who died before adequate solutions emerged. This history raises uncomfortable questions about institutional learning and innovation under combat conditions. American military doctrine in 1944 was sophisticated, informed by analysis of previous conflicts, developed by professional officers and civilian experts. Yet this doctrine had not anticipated the bocage problem, despite aerial reconnaissance showing hedgerow terrain clearly before the invasion launched. No specialized equipment was developed during the months of overlord planning. No training replicated bocage conditions for units that would fight there. The failure was systemic, reflecting assumptions about warfare that did not account for terrain that favored defenders. The solution came not from military institutions but from a sergeant who improvised with available materials and borrowed inspiration from another soldier whose name was forgotten. This pattern of battlefield innovation by junior enlisted soldiers, solving problems that staff officers did not recognize, recurs throughout military history with frequency that suggests organizational structures often inhibit rather than facilitate adaptation. Curtis Cullen was not a military genius. He was a competent soldier who recognized a good idea when he heard it and possessed the initiative to act without waiting for authorization. The significance of his contribution lies not in individual brilliance, but in demonstrating that tactical problems sometimes require simple solutions, implemented quickly, rather than complex solutions, developed slowly through official channels. The 30 seconds of welding required to attach 4 steel tusks to a tank's bow had greater strategic impact than months of planning that preceded Operation Overlord. This observation is not meant to diminish planning's importance, but to emphasize that even the best plans encounter realities that require adaptation by personnel closest to problems. The institutional response to Cullen's innovation was appropriately rapid once Bradley recognized its value. Ordnance units were mobilized within hours. Production began immediately. Distribution was prioritized for units conducting breakthrough operations. The speed of implementation demonstrated that American military logistics could respond effectively when solutions were identified. But the innovation itself came from outside official channels, from a sergeant who was willing to violate protocols by using materials and time without authorization. This tension between institutional procedure and battlefield necessity defines much of military innovation's history. Modern armies face similar challenges. Doctrine and equipment are developed years before conflicts begin, based on assumptions about how future wars will be fought. When reality contradicts assumptions, personnel must adapt quickly or suffer casualties while waiting for institutional responses. The organizations that adapt fastest, that empower junior personnel to implement solutions without navigating bureaucratic obstacles, gain tactical advantages that can prove strategically decisive. The hedgerow cutter's legacy extends beyond Normandy. American armor doctrine from 1944 onward consistently emphasized the importance of enabling tank operations across varied terrain without requiring specialized preparation. Post-war tank designs incorporated lessons learned about the need for vehicles to overcome obstacles independently. Modern combat engineering equipment reflects understanding that mobility depends on ability to breach barriers rapidly rather than avoiding them or requiring extensive preparation before crossing. Curtis Coulin's memorial stands in Cranford, New Jersey, a boulder with an affixed plaque commemorating his contribution to victory in Europe. The memorial quotes Eisenhower's 1961 address describing the morale impact of Coulin's invention. Few visitors to Cranford's municipal building likely understand the full significance of what a local sergeant accomplished during 2 weeks in July 1944. The story has been simplified in popular memory to focus on individual heroism and American ingenuity, narrative elements that fit comfortably within cultural expectations about how wars are won. The deeper truth is more complex and more instructive. Wars are won by soldiers who improvise solutions to immediate problems, regardless of whether those solutions align with official doctrine. Wars are won by institutions that recognize valuable innovations rapidly and implement them at scale. Wars are won by commanders who are willing to trust that a sergeant with no engineering degree might solve a problem that trained officers could not. And wars are won by simple modifications that change one critical variable, allowing existing equipment to perform tasks it could not accomplish before. The morning of July 25, 1944, when Operation Cobra launched with 60% of First Army's tanks equipped with hedgerow cutters, American forces began the transformation from trapped invaders to liberating army. The breakout that followed, the race across France, the liberation of Paris, all depended on mobility that Rhino tanks provided during the critical weeks when Bocage threatened to paralyze operations indefinitely. German defenders in Normandy could not have held indefinitely regardless of terrain advantages. American material superiority, air power, artillery, and logistics would have prevailed eventually through grinding attrition. But eventual victory achieved at terrible cost is different from rapid breakthrough accomplished because one sergeant recognized that steel tusks welded to tanks would prevent the climb that was killing crews. The difference measured in lives saved and time gained is the difference between military operations that succeed according to plan and operations that succeed because personnel close to problems implement solutions that planners never considered. Curtis Coulin's contribution to Allied victory is remembered imperfectly because individual innovations rarely fit neatly into grand narratives about strategy and national mobilization. The hedgerow cutter was not sophisticated technology. It was not the product of research establishments or defense contractors. It was steel pieces welded together by a sergeant who understood that preventing tanks from climbing obstacles was simpler than finding ways to protect them while climbing. This simplicity is the innovation's most important characteristic, demonstrating that effective solutions need not be complex or require extensive resources. The soldiers of First Army, who advanced through Normandy in late July and early August, smashing through hedgerows that had blocked progress for weeks, understood what Coulin's device meant operationally. They were not military historians considering strategic significance. They were men who had watched friends die during hedgerow crossings and who now crossed those same obstacles, without fear. Their relief and gratitude, expressed in letters and memoirs written decades later, provides the most authentic assessment of what a sergeant's 32nd Weld accomplished in summer 1944. The technical specifications of the Rhino device, documented in Army Ordnance records, reveal engineering simplicity that belies its tactical significance. Each assembly consisted of 4 steel prongs, cut from German beach obstacles to lengths between 18 and 24 inches, depending on available material. The prongs were welded to a horizontal crossbar, fabricated from additional steel beam sections, creating a frame that protruded approximately 2 feet forward of the tank's bow. The entire assembly weighed between 200 and 300 pounds, negligible compared to a Sherman's 30-ton mass. Mounting brackets attached the frame to the tank's lower glacis plate using existing bolt holes and reinforcement points. Installation required no permanent modification to the tank's structure. Crews could remove assemblies when they were no longer needed, though few commanders chose to do so given the minimal weight penalty and potential future utility. The prongs themselves were sharpened on their forward edges to enhance penetration through compacted soil and root systems, though testing demonstrated that even unsharpened prongs functioned adequately against most hedgerows. German defensive doctrine in Normandy had been predicated on assumptions about American armor mobility that the Rhino device invalidated completely. German commanders positioned their limited forces to cover road networks and field entrances, the choke points where American tanks were forced to maneuver if they wished to avoid climbing hedgerows. Anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and concealed armor concentrated at these locations could engage predictable targets, moving through terrain that channeled their approach. The modification allowed American armor to bypass these prepared positions entirely. Tank commanders could choose breach points that German forces were not covering, creating holes through hedgerows at locations selected for tactical advantage rather than being constrained to existing openings. This flexibility transformed the tactical calculus of Bocage warfare fundamentally. German defenders could no longer predict where American armor would appear. Strong points that should have anchored defensive lines became isolated as tanks bypassed them, emerging behind positions that were oriented to defend against frontal assault. The psychological impact on German soldiers fighting in the Bocage extended beyond tactical surprise. German defensive success during June and early July had depended partly on understanding terrain advantages and exploiting them through positioning and fire discipline. Soldiers who had held fields against numerically superior forces, who had watched American tanks expose themselves repeatedly during hedgerow crossings, discovered their tactical expertise had been rendered obsolete by a simple mechanical modification. This realization, spreading through German units during the final days of July as Cobra shattered defensive lines, contributed to the collapse of organized resistance. Units that might have conducted orderly withdrawals to successive defensive positions instead disintegrated into scattered groups, attempting individual survival. Officers lost confidence in their ability to establish new defensive lines when terrain that should have favored defense was being penetrated as easily as open ground. Soldiers lost confidence in officers who could not explain how Americans had solved the hedgerow problem or what measures could counter the new capability. The manufacturing process for Rhino devices demonstrated American logistical capacity operating under combat conditions. Ordnance companies established production facilities within artillery range of German positions, working under camouflage netting to conceal activity from aerial reconnaissance and forward observers. Welders worked in shifts around the clock, cutting steel sections from beach obstacles and assembling them into prongs and frames using portable arc welding equipment that had been rushed to Normandy by air transport at Bradley's orders. The work was dangerous, not merely from proximity to combat, but from the industrial hazards inherent in rapid fabrication under field conditions. Arc welding generates intense light that can damage vision if proper protective equipment is not used consistently. Metal cutting creates sharp edges and hot debris that can cause injury. Working at night under blackout conditions while wearing protective gear required concentration and discipline that exhaustion threatened constantly. Several welders suffered burns or cuts that required medical attention. None of these injuries were recorded in official casualty statistics because they did not result from enemy action, but they represented real costs of the rapid implementation Bradley demanded. The steel quality of captured German beach obstacles proved excellent for the modification's purpose. German engineers had designed these obstacles to withstand repeated impacts from landing craft, requiring structural steel with high tensile strength and resistance to stress fractures. These same properties made the steel ideal for penetrating hedgerows that consisted partly of compacted stone. Lesser quality steel might have bent or cracked when prongs struck particularly dense sections of hedgerow, but the German structural steel maintained integrity through repeated use. This irony was not lost on American soldiers who understood they were using German materials designed to stop the invasion to facilitate the breakout from Normandy. Some crews painted messages on their rhino prongs thanking Hitler for providing the steel. The humor was dark, typical of combat soldiers finding small satisfactions where they could, but it reflected awareness that German defensive preparations had inadvertently supplied exactly what Americans needed to overcome terrain obstacles. British production of prongs followed different manufacturing methods that reflected contrasts in available resources and industrial organization. British facilities in the United Kingdom possessed more sophisticated metal working equipment than American field units operating in Normandy, allowing more precise fabrication with tighter tolerances. British engineers modified the basic design slightly, altering prong angles and reinforcement points based on testing against hedgerows in southern England that approximated Normandy conditions. These modifications produced devices that were marginally more effective in controlled tests, but functionally equivalent in combat operations. The lesson was that adequate solutions implemented rapidly mattered more than optimal solutions developed slowly. American rhino devices were cruder than British prongs, but American devices entered combat first, and in larger numbers, because fabrication occurred immediately in theater, using available materials, rather than waiting for refined designs from distant factories. The distribution of completed rhino devices to frontline units followed prioritization based on operational requirements for Cobra. The 2nd Armored Division, which would conduct breakthrough operations after bombing created the initial rupture in German lines, received devices first. Tank battalions supporting the assault received priority over those designated for exploitation phases. Within each battalion, company commanders decided which individual tanks would receive modifications based on crew experience and tactical roles. The most experienced crews often received Rhino tanks because commanders trusted them to exploit the mobility advantage fully. However, some commanders distributed devices to less experienced crews specifically to reduce the fear factor associated with hedgerow crossing, calculating that confidence gained from having the modification would improve overall performance even among crews who might not use the device as aggressively as veterans would. The first combat employment of Rhino devices in large numbers came during Cobra's opening phases on July 25. Tank commanders who had been briefed on the modification's capabilities approached hedgerows with caution, uncertain whether the device would perform as advertised under actual combat conditions with German defenders firing at them during the crossing. The first successful breaches conducted under fire validated the design immediately and transformed crew confidence for subsequent operations. Within hours, tank commanders were requesting permission to advance more rapidly, arguing that the hedgerows were no longer significant obstacles and that exploitation should begin immediately rather than waiting for infantry to secure positions methodically. This aggressive mindset contrasted sharply with the cautious approach that had characterized American armor operations during the previous 6 weeks, demonstrating how quickly tactical psychology shifted once the hedgerow problem was solved. German prisoners captured during Cobra expressed confusion and dismay when interrogated about American tank modifications. Intelligence officers conducting these interrogations reported that German soldiers described feeling helpless when American tanks appeared through hedgerows at locations that should have been impassable. Some prisoners believed Americans had deployed new tank models with superior mobility characteristics. Others thought explosive charges were being used to breach hedgerows silently, a technically implausible explanation that reflected desperation to rationalize what they had experienced. When interrogators showed German prisoners the Rhino devices and explained how they functioned, the typical response was silence or bitter laughter at the simplicity of a solution that had defeated elaborate defensive preparations. German engineering had produced sophisticated weapons, including jet aircraft and ballistic missiles during the war's final years, yet German forces had been defeated in Normandy partly by steel prongs welded to tank bows. This contrast between technological sophistication and tactical effectiveness would inform German military thinking during the post-war period. The comparison with other American modifications developed during the Normandy campaign provides context for understanding the Rhino device's significance. Bulldozer blades fitted to Sherman tanks proved highly effective for pushing through hedgerows and clearing obstacles, but required dedicated vehicles that were vulnerable to focused anti-tank fire. Tank battalions possessed only 4 to 6 dozer tanks each, insufficient for operations requiring multiple simultaneous breaches. Explosive charges could destroy hedgerows completely, but required engineer teams to emplace them under fire and alerted German defenders to imminent assault. The Rhino device offered advantages none of these alternatives provided. Any Sherman could be modified without reducing combat capability. The modification added minimal weight and did not interfere with weapon systems. Crews could breach hedgerows without dismounting or requiring engineer support. The breaching could be conducted quickly without lengthy preparation, maintaining tactical tempo essential for exploitation operations. These combined advantages made the Rhino device superior to alternative solutions for mobile warfare in Bocage terrain. The lasting impact on American armor doctrine stemmed from recognition that terrain obstacles could be overcome through simple mechanical modifications rather than requiring specialized vehicles or extensive preparation. Post-war tank development programs included requirements for vehicles to operate across varied terrain without external support. Engineer vehicle variants were developed specifically to accompany armor formations and provide breaching capability when obstacles exceeded what standard tanks could overcome independently. The entire approach to obstacle crossing shifted from viewing it as exceptional problem requiring special solutions to viewing it as standard challenge that vehicles should handle routinely. Modern combat engineering equipment used by American and Allied forces traces lineage directly to lessons learned in Normandy about the importance of enabling mobility through obstacle-dense terrain. Mine plows, dozer blades, and specialized breaching equipment are now standard components of armored formations rather than specialized assets allocated sparingly. The doctrinal emphasis on maintaining mobility regardless of terrain reflects understanding that operational tempo depends on ability to bypass or breach obstacles rapidly rather than being channeled through defended openings. Curtis Cullen's personal story after the war provides coda to his wartime innovation. His injury in the Hurtgen Forest occurred during operations that were as costly and controversial as the Bocage fighting had been. The Hurtgen Forest battles represented another example of American forces fighting through terrain that favored defenders, suffering terrible casualties to achieve objectives of questionable strategic value. Cullen's experience thus encompassed both successful adaptation to challenging terrain and the limits of what tactical innovation could accomplish when operational decisions forced fighting on disadvantageous ground. His post-war career as a salesman for Schenley Industries was unremarkable by any standard except the contrast with his wartime fame. The man whose invention had been credited with helping win the Battle of Normandy spent his remaining years in anonymity, selling liquor to retailers in New York City. He did not seek publicity or leverage his wartime service into professional advancement. When President Eisenhower sent his parents a telegram of condolence upon Curtis's death in 1963, the gesture acknowledged a debt that had never been adequately repaid. The historical memory of Cullen's contribution has been preserved through multiple channels that ensure the story remains accessible to subsequent generations. General Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, described the Rhino device and credited Cullen by name, establishing the sergeant's place in official histories of the Normandy campaign. President Eisenhower repeated the story in his 1961 address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and again in a 1964 television interview with Walter Cronkite, filmed in Normandy on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. These high-profile recountings by senior commanders gave Cullen's story legitimacy and visibility that prevented it from being forgotten. Local memorialization in Cranford, New Jersey, has maintained awareness of Cullen's achievement within his home community. The plaque installed in 1992 on the grounds of the Cranford Municipal Building quotes Eisenhower and explains the historical significance of the hedgerow cutter. Cullen Drive, a street in Cranford, bears his name. The Cranford Historical Society maintains documentation of his life and service. A maintenance facility at Fort Knox was named in his honor, though this honor is less widely known than the local memorials. These commemorative efforts serve important functions beyond honoring individual achievement. They demonstrate that ordinary citizens in extraordinary circumstances can make decisive contributions to national success. They provide tangible connection between local communities and historical events that shaped the modern world. They remind subsequent generations that innovation and initiative matter as much as following procedures and obeying orders. The debate among military historians about whether rhino devices were as widely used or as effective as popular accounts suggest reflects legitimate scholarly concern about distinguishing verified facts from embellished legend. The numbers are ambiguous enough to support different interpretations. 500 devices manufactured in Normandy cannot equip 60% of 2,000 tanks unless British production and devices manufactured in England, then shipped to France, are included in the total. Some accounts may have conflated rhino prongs with bulldozer blades and other hedgerow crossing equipment when calculating modification percentages. However, the debate over exact numbers should not obscure the fundamental historical reality. American armor operations in early July were constrained severely by inability to cross hedgerows safely. American armor operations in early August were characterized by mobility that German forces could not contain. The Rhino device was among the key modifications that enabled this transformation, regardless of whether it equipped 60% or 40% or 30% of tanks. The capability it provided was tactically significant at whatever scale it was implemented. The comparative effectiveness question is similarly complex, because effectiveness depends on metrics chosen for evaluation. If effectiveness is measured by number of hedgerows breached per device, bulldozer blades may have been superior. If effectiveness is measured by tactical surprise achieved, Rhino devices used in Cobra may have been superior because Germans did not anticipate the capability. If effectiveness is measured by crew confidence and willingness to maneuver aggressively, the psychological impact of having any hedgerow crossing capability may have mattered more than technical performance differences between modification types. What remains beyond dispute is that Curtis Cullen recognized value in an idea others dismissed, acted on that recognition without waiting for authorization, fabricated a working prototype using available materials, and demonstrated it to commanders who recognized its potential immediately. This sequence of individual initiative, rapid prototyping, and institutional response represents military innovation functioning as it should, but rarely does. The rarity of such examples explains why Cullen's story endures in military education as illustration of how junior personnel can solve problems that senior leadership did not recognize. The broader lesson for military organizations concerns the balance between standardization and innovation. Standardization enables logistics, training, and interoperability at scale. Armies cannot function effectively if every unit improvises unique solutions to common problems. But excessive standardization creates rigidity that prevents adaptation when situations arise that doctrine did not anticipate. The optimal balance allows sufficient flexibility for personnel closest to problems to implement solutions rapidly, while maintaining enough standardization to enable organizational learning and resource allocation. American military culture in 1944 contained more flexibility than German military culture, partly because American forces were expanding rapidly, with personnel drawn from civilian society that valued pragmatic problem-solving over adherence to proper procedures. German military culture emphasized technical proficiency and following doctrine, which produced excellence in execution, but sometimes inhibited adaptation. This cultural difference contributed to American success in developing and implementing the Rhino device, while German forces struggled to counter it effectively. The final assessment of Curtis Cullen's contribution must acknowledge both what the hedgerow cutter accomplished and what it represented symbolically. Operationally, it enabled American armor to breach obstacles that had constrained mobility for 6 weeks, facilitating the Cobra breakout that accelerated the liberation of France by weeks or months. Symbolically, it demonstrated that American tactical flexibility and industrial capacity could overcome German defensive advantages through rapid innovation and implementation. Both the operational and symbolic dimensions mattered for sustaining Allied morale and undermining German confidence during the campaign's critical phase. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.